Picture this. It's the dead of night in the Palace of Versailles, 1777, and the most powerful woman in France is sobbing into her silk pillows. Not because of war, not because of poverty, not because of revolution brewing in the streets. No, Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, is crying because after 7 years of marriage, her husband still hasn't touched her. 7 whole years. The entire court knows it. Foreign ambassadors are writing about it. Her own mother is sending her letters from Austria, practically begging her to figure out what the hell is wrong with her husband. And here's the kicker that's gonna blow your mind. She's not alone. Throughout history, some of the most powerful thrones in Europe were occupied by men who couldn't do the one job that actually mattered in their world, having kids. And when kings can't perform, queens gotta make choices that would change the course of history forever. You think you know royal history. You think it's all about crowns and conquests and fancy balls. Nah, strip away the pageantry, and you'll find bedrooms full of secrets, lies, and scandals that would make modern reality TV look like a kid's show. This is the story nobody wants to tell you, the story hidden in footnotes and whispered in the shadows of history. This is about the pregnancies that shouldn't have happened, the children who weren't really their father's sons, and the bloodlines built on straight-up deception. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear is gonna rewrite everything you thought you knew about royalty. Let's roll back to France, because honestly, where else would we start when we're talking about royal drama? Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. You've heard about them, right? The cake lady and the guy who lost his head during the French Revolution. But nobody talks about the 7-year nightmare that came before all that. When Marie was just 14 years old, barely even understanding what marriage meant, she was shipped off from Vienna to marry the future king of France. Political alliance, they called it. A chess move between empires. The girl didn't speak French properly yet, and boom, she's expected to produce the next heir to the throne. Except nothing happens. Month after month, year after year, nothing. The whole court is watching, waiting, counting cycles like it's some kind of twisted game show. Marie's mother, Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, is losing her damn mind across the border. She's writing letters that are basically howling at her daughter to figure it out, to seduce him better, to do whatever it takes. Imagine getting letters from your mom asking why you're still a virgin after 5 years of marriage. The humiliation was unreal. But here's the thing, it wasn't Marie's fault. Louis had a medical condition, probably phimosis, which basically meant doing the deed was painful or impossible for him. Dude needed a minor surgical procedure but was too embarrassed to get it done. Too scared. So night after night, he'd come to her chambers, they'd lay there awkwardly, and nothing would happen. The King of France, one of the most powerful men on earth, couldn't consummate his own marriage. The whispers started spreading like wildfire. Servants talked. Courtiers gossiped. Foreign spies reported back to their governments that France's royal marriage was a joke. Some people even started wondering if Marie would take a lover, if she'd do what queens throughout history had done when their husbands couldn't deliver. The pressure was suffocating. Finally, after 7 years, Louis got the procedure done. And suddenly, boom, 4 kids in quick succession. But even then, even after they finally had children, the rumors never fully died. Some historians still whisper that maybe, just maybe, not all those kids were Louis'. When you've spent 7 years being humiliated, when the whole world knows your husband couldn't perform, how do you ever really shake that shadow? Now let's jump over to Russia, because if you thought France was messy, you ain't seen nothing yet. Catherine the Great, one of the most badass rulers in history, started out as just another imported princess married off for politics. Her husband, Peter III. And let me tell you, this guy was a piece of work. Historians describe him as childish, obsessed with toy soldiers, more interested in playing military games than actually ruling or, being a husband. Catherine later wrote in her memoirs, barely disguised, that her marriage went unconsummated for years. Peter apparently had issues, physical and mental, that made him either unable or completely uninterested in his wife. Meanwhile, Catherine was young, smart, ambitious, and stuck in a loveless marriage with a man-child who'd rather play with dolls than build a dynasty. So what did she do? Exactly what you'd expect a woman in her position to do. She took lovers. Several of them. The most significant was Grigory Orlov, a military officer who was everything Peter wasn't. Strong, commanding, actually interested in Catherine as a woman. When Catherine got pregnant, the whole court knew it couldn't be Peter's. The timeline didn't add up. The circumstances didn't add up. But here's the wild part, nobody could officially say anything. Because admitting the heir to the Russian throne wasn't legitimate would throw the entire empire into chaos. So everyone just played along with the lie. Catherine gave birth, the child was presented as Peter's, and the charade continued. Eventually, Catherine got so fed up with Peter's incompetence that she straight up overthrew him in a coup, had him arrested, forced him to abdicate, and 8 days later he mysteriously died. Most historians think she had him killed. And you know what? The Russian people loved her for it. They were so sick of Peter's BS that they welcomed Catherine taking full control. She ruled for 34 years, expanded the empire, and became known as Catherine the Great. All because her husband couldn't handle his business in the bedroom or anywhere else. Spain's got its own nightmare story, and this one's even more twisted. Charles II, known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. This poor dude was the product of so much royal inbreeding that he could barely function as a human being, let alone as a king or a husband. His jaw was so deformed he couldn't chew food properly. He had constant digestive issues. He was probably intellectually disabled. And yeah, he was completely impotent. Charles was married twice, desperately trying to produce an heir because the entire Spanish Habsburg line depended on it. But nothing happened. Contemporary accounts describe him as unable to consummate either marriage. Doctors examined him, priests prayed over him, and everyone basically agreed that this dude physically could not have children. When he finally died at 38, the Spanish Habsburg line died with him, leading to the War of Spanish Succession and reshaping European politics for generations. The crazy part, people at the time actually thought he was cursed or bewitched, hence the nickname. They couldn't comprehend that centuries of cousins marrying cousins had created this genetic train wreck. They needed a supernatural explanation because the truth was too horrible to face. That royal bloodline purity had destroyed itself from within. Let's talk about England now, because the Brits have their own collection of royal bedroom disasters. George III, the king who lost America, also lost his mind. Literally. He suffered from what was probably porphyria, a genetic disorder that caused episodes of madness. During these episodes, which got worse as he aged, he'd rave, hallucinate, and completely lose touch with reality. Here's where it gets scandalous. Queen Charlotte kept having children throughout his reign, even during periods when George was clearly not mentally present. 15 kids total. 15. And toward the end of his life, when George was permanently mad, locked away in Windsor Castle talking to trees and thinking he was married to someone else entirely, people started doing the math. How exactly was Charlotte getting pregnant during times when George couldn't even recognize her? The implications were massive, but nobody dared speak them out loud. Suggesting that any of the royal children weren't George's legitimate offspring would be treason. But the whispers existed, quiet and persistent. Some historians have pointed to close relationships Charlotte had with courtiers. Others suggest that maybe during George's lucid periods he was still capable, but the timeline gets real fuzzy. What we know for sure is that a king who spent years not knowing his own name somehow kept producing heirs, and that mathematical impossibility made people wonder. James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, here's another fascinating case. This dude was super close with male favorites throughout his life, especially the Duke of Buckingham. Like, uncomfortably close by any standard. Letters between them that still exist today are basically love letters, talking about longing and devotion in ways that, let's be real, were way more than just friendship. James was married to Anne of Denmark, and she did have several children, though most died young. But throughout their marriage, people whispered about whether James was actually capable of or interested in fathering them. Some historians argue he was bisexual, others say he was gay, and the pregnancies were results of obligatory encounters, and some contemporary sources hint that maybe Anne had help from elsewhere. We'll never know for sure, but what we do know is that James's relationships with men were so intense and public that they overshadowed his marriage entirely. His son, Charles I, definitely existed and definitely was James's biological kid. But the questions around the other pregnancies, the ones that didn't survive or the circumstances around conception, those questions lingered in court gossip for decades. France again, because apparently they couldn't get enough drama. Henry III was another king whose sexuality was questioned throughout his reign. He surrounded himself with young male favorites called mignons, dressed elaborately, wore earrings, and generally didn't conform to masculine expectations of the time. His wife, Louise of Lorraine, never had children during their marriage, and Henry died without an heir. Now, was Henry gay? Was he impotent? Was he just uninterested in women? Historical sources conflict, but what's clear is that his marriage was never consummated successfully enough to produce children. Some accounts suggest Louise may have been pregnant at various points, but miscarried. Others hint that Henry simply never performed his husbandly duties. Either way, the lack of children combined with his flamboyant lifestyle made everyone assume the king couldn't or wouldn't do what was necessary to continue his line. Edward II of England. Now this is one of the most famous cases of royal homosexuality in history. Edward was completely obsessed with Piers Gaveston, a knight he elevated to absurd levels of power and wealth. Their relationship was so intense and so public that it caused actual rebellions. The nobility was pissed that this random dude had so much influence over the king, and everyone assumed it was because they were lovers. Edward did marry Isabella of France, and she did have children, including the future Edward III. But here's where it gets messy. Isabella and Edward's marriage fell apart spectacularly. She eventually fled to France, took a lover named Roger Mortimer, raised an army, invaded England, deposed her husband, and had him imprisoned. Edward died in captivity under mysterious circumstances, with some historical accounts suggesting he was murdered in a particularly gruesome way designed to mock his sexuality. The big question historians still debate: were Isabella's children actually Edward's? The timeline suggests they probably were, at least the first couple, conceived early in the marriage before things went completely sideways. But the youngest ones, when Edward and Isabella were barely speaking and he was fully devoted to other male favorites, that gets hazier. Nobody at the time dared question it openly, but the math was there for anyone willing to look closely. William III and Mary II, joint rulers of England, never had children during their marriage. Not one. And William's sexuality was questioned throughout his reign. He had extremely close relationships with male favorites, particularly Hans Willem Bentinck and later Arnold van Keppel. The intensity of these friendships raised eyebrows even in a time when male friendships were generally more physically affectionate than modern standards. Mary reportedly wanted children desperately, but it never happened. Was William impotent? Was he gay and uninterested in women? Was there a medical issue? We don't know, but what we do know is that the lack of heirs from their marriage caused a succession crisis. When Mary died and William ruled alone until his own death, the throne passed to Mary's sister Anne, fundamentally altering the line of succession. Spain shows up again with Alfonso XIII in the early 20th century. Now Alfonso definitely had children, that's not in question. But here's the scandal. He carried the gene for hemophilia, which he passed to some of his sons through his wife Victoria Eugenie. Hemophilia was called the royal disease because it ran through Queen Victoria's descendants, affecting various European royal families. The scandal wasn't about Alfonso's ability to have children. It was about whether all of them were actually his. Victoria Eugenie was reportedly devastated by the hemophilia diagnosis and the suffering it caused their sons. Some historical accounts suggest she may have sought comfort elsewhere, leading to whispers about the paternity of some of the later children. Alfonso himself was known to have numerous affairs, and the marriage was strained to the breaking point. In a relationship that toxic, where medical tragedy met personal betrayal, the questions about whose children were whose became inevitable. Back to Russia one more time with Tsar Paul I. Remember Catherine the Great? Well, Paul was supposedly her son with Peter III, but literally nobody believed that. The timing of Catherine's pregnancy coincided perfectly with her intense affair with Grigory Orlov. Paul didn't look like Peter, didn't act like him, and Catherine herself treated Paul with cold distance throughout his life, almost like she resented his existence. Some historians think Catherine's coldness toward Paul came from guilt, knowing he was illegitimate but unable to ever acknowledge it. Others think she just didn't like him as a person. Either way, when Paul eventually became Tsar, he spent his reign basically undoing everything Catherine had built, like he was rebelling against a mother who never truly accepted him. He was eventually assassinated in a coup, partly because he was such a disaster as a ruler, but maybe also carrying the psychological damage of being a living lie. Finally, let's talk about Louis XIII of France, father of the famous Sun King. Louis was painfully shy, deeply religious, and reportedly needed constant encouragement and basically coaching to consummate his marriage with Anne of Austria. Contemporary accounts describe his wedding night as a disaster, with Louis too nervous and uncomfortable to do anything. It took months of pressure from his mother and court advisors before the marriage was finally consummated. Even after that, Louis and Anne's relationship was distant and cold. They lived largely separate lives. Louis had intense emotional relationships with male favorites, particularly the Duke of Lines, leading to speculation about his sexuality. Anne didn't get pregnant for years, and when she finally did, giving birth to the future Louis XIV, people whispered about the timing and circumstances. Some historians suggest Anne may have had help from elsewhere, though this is heavily debated and probably just scandalous gossip. What's undeniable is that Louis's discomfort with physical intimacy was well documented and caused serious problems for the succession. So what does all of this mean? Why does it matter that kings throughout history struggled with impotence, sexuality, and basic physical function? Because it exposes the biggest lie of monarchy, the idea of divine right, of pure bloodlines, of legitimate succession ordained by God. These thrones, these empires that ruled over millions of people, they were built on foundations of sand. They were built on lies that everyone agreed to believe because the alternative, chaos and civil war, was too terrible to consider. Queens throughout history were put in impossible positions. They were expected to produce heirs, but what happens when your husband can't help you do that? You could remain childless and watch your kingdom fall into succession crisis. You could take a lover and risk execution for adultery if caught. Or you could take a lover, get pregnant, and hope that everyone would just play along with the fiction that the child was legitimate. Many of them chose option 3, and honestly, who could blame them? These weren't just personal scandals. These were political earthquakes with consequences that echoed through generations. Wars were fought over disputed successions. Dynasties collapsed because they couldn't produce legitimate heirs. Revolutions happened partly because people lost faith in the divine nature of monarchy, when it became obvious that royal families were just as dysfunctional and human as everyone else. The French Revolution didn't just happen because of bread prices and taxes. It happened because people were done pretending that Louis and Marie Antoinette were special, were different, were ordained by God to rule. When everyone knows the king couldn't consummate his marriage for 7 years, when everyone's laughing about it in taverns and coffee houses, The mystique of monarchy dies. You can't claim divine right when everyone knows you're just a regular dude with medical issues. Catherine the Great's story shows what happens when a woman decides she's done playing by the rules. She took lovers, had children, seized power, and ruled more effectively than any of the legitimate male monarchs around her. She proved that bloodline didn't matter, that divine right was a joke, and that capability mattered more than legitimacy. Russia thrived under her rule specifically because she refused to be limited by her impotent husband's inadequacy. These stories also reveal something darker about royal life: the absolute lack of privacy, of agency, of basic human dignity. Imagine your bedroom problems being discussed by foreign ambassadors. Imagine your mother writing you letters about your sex life. Imagine doctors examining you while courtiers take notes. These people lived in gilded prisons where their bodies weren't their own, where their most intimate moments were state business. And let's be real about something else. A lot of these impotence issues probably came from the same source as Charles II's devastating disabilities: inbreeding. Royal families married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, over and over again to keep bloodlines pure. But that genetic narrowing didn't create purity, it created disaster. It created physical deformities, mental illness, and sexual dysfunction. The very thing they were trying to preserve, their precious bloodline, they destroyed through their obsession with keeping it uncontaminated. The hemophilia that plagued Alfonso's children and spread through European royal families came from Queen Victoria, and it spread specifically because royal families only married other royal families. They were all related, all sharing the same limited gene pool, all passing the same genetic disasters back and forth like a horrible game of hot potato. The royal disease was literally caused by their refusal to marry regular people. What these 11 cases teach us is that power built on lies will always crumble eventually. You can maintain a fiction for years, even decades, but truth has a way of leaking out. Those whispered rumors, those carefully hidden affairs, those questions about paternity, they all became historical record eventually. And now we can look back and see just how fragile and ridiculous the whole system was. Modern DNA testing has actually confirmed some of these suspicions. Scientists have tested remains of various royals and found genetic surprises that prove what gossip suspected centuries ago. Some of those disputed children really weren't their father's offspring. Some of those rumors were absolutely true. History isn't just what's written in official records, it's also what's whispered in private and proven true generations later. So the next time someone talks about the glory of monarchy, about noble bloodlines and royal heritage, remember these stories. Remember the kings who couldn't perform, the queens who had to make impossible choices, the children whose very existence was a lie everyone agreed to maintain. Remember that thrones were built on deception, that crowns sat on heads of people just as flawed and human as anyone else. These weren't gods. They weren't divinely appointed. They were just people, often people with serious issues, who happened to be born into the right families and maintained power through carefully constructed fictions. And when those fictions fell apart, when impotence exposed affairs, when questioned paternity revealed the truth, entire dynasties crumbled. The lesson isn't just historical curiosity. It's about questioning power, questioning legitimacy, questioning the stories we're told about who deserves to rule and why. If European monarchies could maintain lies this big for this long, what other comfortable fictions are we still believing today? What other power structures are built on foundations just as shaky as these impotent kings and their desperate queens? That's the real story behind these royal pregnancies. Not just scandal and gossip, but a fundamental challenge to how we think about power, legitimacy, and truth. These 11 cases aren't just weird historical footnotes. They're proof that the mighty can fall, that lies eventually surface, and that human nature will always find a way, even in the most restricted and controlled environments imaginable. So Next time you're watching some historical drama about noble kings and virtuous queens, remember what was really happening behind those castle walls. Remember the 7 years of humiliation, the secret lovers, the disputed children, and the elaborate lies that everyone pretended to believe. Because that's the real history, the human history, the messy and complicated truth that no official portrait or grand monument will ever show you.